Hi. So it's great to be back in Toronto, and I am so grateful to Derek for all he's doing up here, as you heard. I thought it was longer than 11 years ago, but I guess that's right. We ran into each other. And he wanted me to talk about trauma in couples, which is a lot in one day. So we're going to have to move pretty fast. Although being in a couple is traumatic, generally. So we can kind of combine them. So how many of you know something about IFS already? Raise your hand. So for how many of you is this quite new? Okay, wow, okay. So I'm going to condense an intro that I typically do in about 3 hours to about 15 minutes. And then I think I'll show some video, and depending on the timing, I've got a video of a couple maybe for this afternoon. Could also, if there is a couple who wants to take a chance and do a demo here, so if there's somebody up for that. So that's what I have in mind. I'm open to persuasion if you have other ideas. But just to jump in, so yeah, as Derek said, about 30 some years ago, I'm pretty old, I figured this out. I'm trained as a family therapist, and I was trying to prove that family therapy was the way, and my clients weren't cooperating in an outcome study I was doing that was supposed to prove this. I didn't realize they'd been cured when we reorganized the families. And they kept binging and purging. There was a bulimic population, and out of frustration, I began asking why, and they started talking about these parts. And they would talk about a part that was critical of them whenever anything happened that was negative in their life, and then another part that would come up in response to that that felt totally worthless and empty and alone, and then to the rescue would come the binge to take them away from that feeling. But the act of the binge would bring the critic back. And to me as a family therapist, this sounded familiar. It sounded like these sequences that I would be tracking and observing in families. So I got intrigued and began trying to apply some of the family stuff to this inner system. And because I, back then, was thinking about these things the way the field still does, unfortunately, which is the critic is a kind of internalized parental voice, and the binge is some kind of out-of-control impulse, I was trying to get my client to stand up to the critic and to control the binge. And so I would give homework assignments to that effect, and my clients were coming back saying, not only did that not work, it's getting worse. But I was like that man in a hole with a shovel. So I'd say, do more, stand up stronger, control more, and it would get worse and worse until the first client I was aware of that had an extensive sex abuse history and also cut herself on her wrist. And by then I'd heard about this Gestalt empty chair technique. Do you know about this? Where you have a client in one chair and an empty chair across from them, and you have them imagine that that part of them is sitting in that chair and having a conversation, and then you have them be the part talking back to them. And I was hearing about 4 and 5 parts, so I've got a room full of chairs, and my clients are hopping all over, until one guy said, you know, I don't really have to move around to do this. I can just sit here. So ever since then, people just sit there. So I've got the cutting part, and one session I decide we're not going to let her leave until it agrees to not cut her. And of course, after a couple hours of badgering it, it finally agrees not to. Open the door to the next session. It's got a big gash down the side of her face. And I collapsed emotionally, and I just said, I give up. I can't beat you at this. And the part said, I don't really want to beat you. And that was an historic moment in the development of this, because I shifted out of that coercive place to just being curious. So why do you do this to her? And the part proceeded to talk about how when she was being abused, it needed to get her out of her body, and it needed to contain the rage that would get her more abuse. And so I shifted once more. Now I'm not just curious, but I have a kind of abiding appreciation for the heroic role it played in her life. And I tell that to the part, and the part bursts into tears, because everyone had demonized it and tried to get rid of it. And talk more about why it still needed to do this, because the anger was still there, and it talked about parts that were very vulnerable that it had to protect, and other things. But as it talked, it sounded like it was still stuck back in that time, like it was living as if she was still 5 years old and in jeopardy all the time. And as I heard all that, I began to think, maybe these parts aren't what they seem. Maybe they're like kids in a family. You know, family therapy's big insight was you can't take a kid out of a family system and expect the kid to change by telling them to cut it out. You've got to work with a network of relationships that are driving his behavior. Maybe the same thing is true, and it turns out to be true. That parts are not what they seem. In fact, position I've come to over all these years is that we're all multiple personalities. People who carry that diagnosis of DID aren't any different from anybody in this room. Their alters are what I call parts. Only their system got fully blown apart by the horrific abuse they suffered. So there are these amnesic barriers, and parts take over and others run. But that's who we are. The nature of the mind is to be multiple that way. That's a kind of radical position, hopefully becoming less radical. And that's a good thing, because all of these parts are wonderful, valuable resources to us in their non-burdened, in their natural states. Why would we have them if they weren't valuable to us? But they're forced out of their valuable states into roles that can be extreme, can be damaging, by events in our lives and the burdens they accrue from those events. So this concept of burden is very important. Parts pick up extreme beliefs and emotions from traumas, from attachment injuries that entered our system and then attach to them almost like a virus and drive the way they operate thereafter. And our field has confused the parts with the burdens they carry. So the closest thing in traditional psychotherapy, this would be an introject. It came into your system, but it isn't just a parental voice, it's a part that's carrying that parental voice. And sometimes using it, sometimes stuck with it, but it drives the way it criticizes you, for example. And if the part unburdens, releases that, it immediately transforms into its natural, valuable state, like magic. It's like a curse has been lifted. Hard to believe. Those of you who've been fooling with this know that what I'm saying is true. Okay, so nothing but good parts. I'm sort of the Will Rogers of the phenomenon. I never met a part that ultimately I didn't like. And I've worked with people who've murdered people, people who've sexually abused little kids, and even those parts, when approached with curiosity, respect, will give their secret histories of how they got forced into these roles, how much they hate what they're doing, how much they carry the burden of their perpetrator's energy that drives them to perpetrate. No bad parts. Nobody to fight with. But all of us and our clients are constantly fighting with the ones that interfere in our lives. And the fighting makes them bigger and stronger and more extreme. Okay, so that's the first concept. There aren't any bad ones. Now, if that isn't hard enough to believe, this next one is even harder for most people. And I stumbled onto it simply because I, again, was applying family stuff to this inner system. And once I got hip to the fact that parts aren't what they seem, and I was trying to get my client to listen to them and get along with them, so I would set up dialogues Again, initially the open chair thing, but then just sitting in place. And as I was trying to get my client to listen to maybe the critic, some part that hated the critic started to come in and my client would get angry. And as a family therapist, we learned whenever you're having two people talk and a third person interferes, ask that one to just step out. So I began asking parts to step out when they would come in and interfere in these dialogues. You following this? And clients could do that. I would say, okay, ask the one who's so angry at the critic to just step back. So, okay, it did. Now how do you feel toward the critic? And it'd be entirely different. Often in the direction of, I'm just curious about why it calls me names. Even sometimes, I feel sorry for it that it has to do this all day. Seconds earlier, hated it. The mere act of getting that hating part to separate released somebody else inside. And that person had these wonderful, curious, compassionate qualities. And I would do it on another client, and the same person popped out. And not only was curious and calm and compassionate, confident, but also had a kind of wisdom about how to relate to the parts in a way that they would relax and feel heard and begin to change. And sometimes that self, I came to call it, would take over sessions, and I would just get out of the way. And 30 minutes later, wow, that was amazing. So I call that the self because when I got people there and asked, what part of you is that? They said, that's not a part, that's more me, that's myself. We call that a self with a capital S to distinguish it from the ordinary use of the word self, which means the whole person, as this special kind of essence that it turns out is in everybody, cannot be damaged, knows how to heal. That one's really hard to believe. And the only reason I believe it is because I've been doing this for 35 years. And I've yet to have a client where we couldn't get that person to pop out and take over a session. And again, I've specialized for 20 years in the treatment of severe, chronic, horrible abuse. Lots of cult survivors, lots of clients with that diagnosis of MPD or DID. And I'm here to tell you, when certain parts step back, the same self pops out. So that's become the centerpiece of the model, this idea that self is in there and how to get self into the lead, both internally and externally, in your life, in your clients' lives, is sort of the big contribution, I think, and is different from virtually any psychotherapy. Happens to be common wisdom in the spiritual world. Virtually every religious tradition, especially the esoteric branches, have a word for this, have practices to try and access it. I stumbled on a way to do it quickly, often, in people that, if you believe basic attachment theory, have no business with any of that kind of ego strain. So I make this statement that people gasp at frequently, which is that attachment theory got it wrong, which is blasphemy in our field. I've been attacked left and right for that. Attachment theory got a lot of things right, a lot of things I value about it. But this basic core belief that to have that inside, you had to get it from the outside. You had to get it from some external relationship is just dead wrong. It's in there. It's our birthright. We come into the world with it. We work with kids down to age 3. They've got it. So this is the big deal. And when you know about it and you help your client access it, your job as a therapist becomes so much easier because you have a co-therapist that lives with your client and knows how to heal them much more than you do. Okay. So that's the self. Now, in the early days, I was hearing about these parts, and I was hearing about parts that were hurting or terrified or felt totally worthless. And it made sense to try and get to those and try and heal those. So I would do what I could to do that, and then found that my clients were having very negative reactions after some of those sessions. Had a client who immediately spiked 103 fever walking out the door almost. Another client got into a car accident after leaving my office and just said she didn't see the car. And at some point I began putting two and two together and figured out there's something I'm doing wrong that's related to these after effects. And then I got scared and thought, oh, this is a much more delicate ecology than I thought. I better just back off. And then I got curious, and instead I started asking what I was doing wrong. And what I learned is what I'm going to teach you, which is this kind of map of the territory. And what I learned was I was violating the rules that protective parts had of the system by going to these very vulnerable places without their permission. So, as a system thinker, I'm looking for these patterns, and the main pattern that's jumped out then and is stuck with as the main distinction among parts, the most important distinction, is between these very vulnerable ones and then the ones who protect them. So I'm going to teach you this little map, not so you impose it on your clients, but so that you don't do the damage to your clients that I did back then. So, protectors, and then these very vulnerable parts. I'm going to start with those vulnerable ones. So when you ever were humiliated or had some kind of trauma, or your parents yelled at you or any of that, you have these young childlike parts who before that event were delightful inner children who lent you lots of creativity and joy and innocence and spontaneity. But after the event, they're the ones who take that to heart the most. They're the sensitive parts that get hurt the most by those kinds of traumas. They take on the burdens of pain, emotional pain, shame, worthlessness, loneliness, desperation, and like that. And after they've been hurt, you don't want anything to do with them. Because you don't know they're just wounded inner children. You think, well, this is the memory of my pain and what happened to me, and I don't want to spend time with that. And at least in the United States, I don't know about Canada, everybody around you said, don't look back, just keep on, just let it go, you can't change what happened. So everybody around you talked you into exiling those emotions, sensations, memories, and beliefs. And unbeknownst to you, you wound up locking up your most precious inner qualities in the form of these hurt inner children that we call the exiles. Everybody's got them. Everybody in this room's got a bunch of exiles in some kind of inner basement or abyss, cyst. Once you get a bunch of exiles, the world becomes more dangerous because things that happen that are remotely similar can trigger them, and when they're triggered, they can explode out of whatever you've got them contained in and take over. Flames of emotion threaten to consume you, and other parts of you think you're going to die, or they think it's as bad as it was when it happened originally. And so we also have parts whose job it is to prevent that from ever happening. And some of them try to manage your life so that you don't get too close to anybody, or you don't get too distant from people you depend on, or you look perfect so no one rejects you, or you perform at a high level. And that's a big job. That's a lot of work to keep you respectable, to keep you from getting hurt again. So we call those the managers, and they're often working all the time. Some of them never sleep. And they often are the critics, these inner critics that we hate because they're so hard on us. But they're criticizing you just to try to get you to behave so you don't get hurt again, usually to look good. Or sometimes they're criticizing you to run down your confidence so you don't take any risks. But they're not just critics, there's also parts that are big caretakers and never let you take care of yourself. Parts that, are trying to please everybody. There are hypervigilant parts that are scanning. These are managers in the sense that they're trying to manage your life to preempt anything that might trigger those exiles. Despite all their work, we get triggered. The world has a way of breaking through those defenses and activating all that pain again, or that shame, or that terror. And again, when that happens, it's a big emergency. You can't stay there very long. So there's another set of parts whose job it is to immediately go into action, to get you higher than the flames, to douse them with some substance, to distract you until they burn themselves out. So we call these firefighters. And we've all got firefighters. The difference between, they're both protectors. Managers, again, are preemptive. Firefighters, after an exile's been triggered, they're reactive, often explosive. Damn the torpedoes. They don't care about the collateral damage to you, your body, or to your relationships. They're just going to get you away from that feeling right now, no matter what. And we've all got a kind of hierarchy of them. So if the first one doesn't work, we go to the next one. If that doesn't work, the next one. The top of that hierarchy for most everybody, which is a big topic this week. Anybody? Suicide. Yeah. And for most of us, it's very comforting to know we have that exit strategy. And here we come along as well-meaning therapists and say, I want you to sign this contract saying you're not going to kill yourself. And you wonder why your clients go crazy, because you just took away their safety net. So that's the map. Protectors, then two different classes of protector, manager, and firefighter, all of working hard to contain and protect exiles. And in most clients, self is nowhere to be found in the beginning because these protectors have been running their lives. They're like, if you're a family therapist, you know the term parentified children. Because they're young. Even the ones that seem so grown up and smart, usually they're at best teenage kids when you get to know them. So it's sort of like Lord of the Flies. Did you read that in high school? It's a bunch of little kids, some of whom had to be the warriors and take over, and some, like Piggy, were vulnerable and were exiled. Okay. So that was what? How did I do? Not bad. So let me pause here and gather any questions or reactions so far, especially for those of you this is new to. Yeah. The question is, why do these burdens stick to these vulnerable parts and drive them that way? I don't really know. I mean, part of it is because we don't unburden them in the moment. So at our annual conference this year, there's going to be a big plenary on bringing this to education. And we have three primary initiatives to do that. And my goal is to make it so that if a kid gets bullied, the teacher helps them find the part that got hurt and unburden it in the moment so that you don't, see, trauma isn't inherently traumatizing. What's traumatizing is the impact it has on your inner system. I know I'm not answering your question, but I'll hopefully circle back to it. So what's traumatizing is it creates that map that I just described to you, where you lock up a bunch of parts and others have to take on these parental roles, and the self is no longer trusted by the parts because self didn't protect you. That's what's traumatizing, and the burdens these parts carry. And I think it's like a kid. You know, there are kids in a family where, you know, the parents are raging at each other, and this kid takes on the belief that it's his fault, or takes on the terror that he's going to lose his parents. Why did he take that on? Just because that's what he felt. It's the same with these parts. They take this stuff on based on what happened in the trauma, and they just kind of believe it now. It's their belief, or their extreme emotion now. It's the best I can do.
I've heard you answer this before, in terms of it's like, if it wasn't, the person wasn't able to be held by an older parent type figure's self to get the perspective that it wasn't all true about them.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of what, they don't have access to their own self to keep it from being a burden.
Yeah, if there isn't somebody, and this goes to attachment theory, to comfort them and say, no, it wasn't your fault, then they're likely to believe it was and hold on to that belief. But, yeah.
They attach to the belief because they need to attach to something, and there isn't the ability to get what they need in the relationship. So it's actually like they have a relationship with the belief.
Sometimes, like the protectors will take on burdens because they feel like they need this rage now to protect the person, so they become dependent on that, and they're reluctant to let it go. But why do exiles pick up burdens? It's because they, you know, any kid who, kids take on the belief that I'm bad rather than my parents because it's safer for them in a way. They can control what they do, and it just becomes a burden. Yeah. So the question is, if I've got a 6-year-old client with lots of protectors, how quickly do I get past them? Is that right? As quickly as they'll let you. So, but no quicker. And that again was the lesson I learned. Now, because I bring a lot of self to my clients, because I've been doing this 30 years and I've done a lot of work with my exiles, a lot of work with my protectors. So maybe not with my wife, am I in self all the time? But with clients, I'm in self most all the time in a big way. And so clients immediately sense the safety of that, and their protectors relax. And I can do sessions, demo sessions, and where we go quite deep very quickly, but still with permission. So, and I'll always start with the protector. And again, this is the reason for the map. It's not to impose on your clients, it's so you know who are the protectors in the system, who are the exiles. I better start with the protectors before I go to the exile. We'll start there, and I'll do my spiel with protectors or ask the questions we ask. And because they trust that I know what I'm doing, and I could pull off what I'm selling, I'm basically a hope merchant, I call myself. So I'm saying to protectors, I get that you're really afraid to go to these places that you've locked up 30 years ago and you've said, I'll never go back to. I understand why you wouldn't want to open that door. You're the boss. We're not going to do it without your permission. But if you gave permission, we can go in there without being overwhelmed. We can get that childlike part that's stuck back in that time out of there, and we can unload all the feelings and beliefs you've been trying to contain. And you'll be able to relax and do something entirely different. What do you think? And if they believe me, which they tend to because I'm so confident, I say, oh, okay, I'll let you try it. And then we open the door. Now, other clients, been betrayed by therapists, been betrayed by their parents over and over. It takes many, many more sessions to build up that trust in me. and I just take as long as it takes. So it really varies. Yeah.
Could you say more about the parts being stuck in time?
Yeah, they are literally stuck in time. They literally, if I did an exercise now, which we don't have time for, but I often do, which I would have you find one of your protectors inside, and as part of the questions you would ask, I would have you ask it, how old do you think I am? Not how old is the part. How old does this part think you are? Most of you would get a single digit for an answer. They are stuck back there. They literally think you're still that age. And they literally think the world is still as dangerous as it was back then. Did you ask why that is, or did you just say?
No, that helps.
That helps? Okay. And updating them is a big relief. And I've had it many times where a client says, no, I'm 68, and the part says, no way. I don't believe you. And is totally shocked. And we have to get a newspaper and look at the date. But once they believe it, I mean, sometimes they say, I don't care how old you are, you're still an idiot. But most of the time, they're relieved to know that you're not a little kid and that you can handle more than they thought. So that's actually a common question now with protectors. How old do you think she is? No, she's not 5 years old. She can handle more than she could back then. You needed to do this when she was 5, and we honor you for it. You saved her life. But no, you don't have to do it now. Anything else so far? Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. And the piece that I sometimes run into trouble with is the level of insight that, like, and not so much with the client, but with the couple, or with even if child protection agencies are called on, like, a couple who's divorcing, and trying to help usually the male partner understand that, not make them understand this. I understand sort of the system of what's going on, but how to even sort of communicate that with people who don't even have this language or sort of framework. Then a lot of the projected fears onto the partner or the family system is a lot of their childhood stuff. Like they're so into a protector
Yeah.
that you can't sue them.
Yeah, so this is important in working with couples, and we'll be talking about it more this afternoon. But that's what we call creating a U-turn in their focus, because their focus is on this out here. They're either on their partner or on the child protection people or the kid. And how do you get them to look inside at their parts? And how, is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah. So we'll spend some time on that this afternoon. Anything else? Okay, so again, I'm very briefly going to talk about how you change all this, and then go to this video, I think. So, as I said, we want to start, well, client comes in, tells me about their problem. First session, I might do the same kind of history you do. My history, I'm particularly interested in, are there any dangerous firefighters I need to know about? So I'm asking questions about suicide attempts and so on, things like that. Because if there are, I want to get to those as soon as possible. Because as long as you don't get to them, they lurk like bombs ready to go off, and it govern how much you can actually do with the inner system. But I'm taking history, and then at some point I'm asking about the problem and their inner experience of the problem, which is related to that U-turn thing. So when this happens, when your wife says this to you, what happens inside of you? What do you feel? What do you say to yourself? Oh, so one part of you gets really angry and wants to yell at her, is that right? Yeah, that's right. Oh, and then another part of you feels really young and scared. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. Like she's going to leave you. Okay. So I'm just reflecting back the way you learned to, graduate school, what my client is saying, but I'm adding the phrase, so one part of you and another part. And clients don't say, what are you talking about? Because everybody in this room probably today or yesterday said something about a part. One part is happy to be here, another part of you would rather be in bed. Everybody uses this language. That's why I use it. It didn't get me very far in academia. It's not the best word because it implies a kind of machine kind of thing. But it's the most common word. Everybody uses it. Everybody's safe with that. Except for people who don't like it, which is not very many. So I'm introducing that idea, people saying, yeah, that's right. At some point I'll say, is there one of these we've identified that you would like to change or want to get to know better or have more control over? They pick that one. If it seems like that's an exile, I'll say, we'll get to that, but first I want to talk to the parts that don't want us to go there for whatever reason. So I'm always, again, trying to start with protectors. So we go to that. Initial steps, pretty simple. Focus on it, find it in your body, around your body. That kind of grounds the work. It gives you a place for your client to focus on as they talk to the part and focus on to get answers from. Most clients can do that pretty readily. Then this question, how do you feel toward this part, is kind of a magic question, because in answering that, they're telling you how much self is present relative to this part, or how much other parts that are polarized with it, don't like it, fear it, are actually answering the question. So they say they hate it, they want to get rid of it. I'll say some version of, that makes sense because it's causing you a lot of trouble. But our goal is just to get to know it now. We're not going to let it take over more. We're just going to get to know it and maybe help it, not have to do this. And if we hate it, that's not going to go well. So see if the one who hates it is willing to give us a little space so you can just be curious and get to know it. It's just a kind of spiel. Most of the time, okay, how do you feel toward it now? Curious, why is it calling me? Why is it doing this to me? Tone of voice, facial expression. Seems like we've got what we call the critical mass of self. There's enough self that the part will respond, whereas before wouldn't, because it was being attacked or the client was too afraid. So ask it. Ask it why it does this, or what's it afraid would happen if it didn't do this, or whatever it wants you to know about itself. Answer comes. Now often it comes from some thinking part, especially in Boston where I live. So I'm constantly getting these thinking parts to step out. Because people have been in traditional therapy and the thinking parts answered the questions. So they think that's what they're supposed to be. In therapy, I'd come in, I'd give you the answers. So get that thinking part to step back, focus again on this one in your body, and wait for the answer to come from that place in your body. And just be patient. If nothing comes, that's okay. So they wait, and now they hear something that sounds like it's from the part. So we work with protector to the point where it conveys what it's protecting. And the big question that gets you there is ask the part what it's afraid would happen if it didn't do this job. And in answering that, usually you'll hear about what it protects or what it's polarized with. So if I'm working with a suicidal part, ask the part what it's afraid would happen if it didn't kill you. You can usually get one of two answers to that. Guesses? You'll continue to suffer, is the most common answer. Or she's evil and she deserves to die. Not nearly as common, but it happens. The first one, the suicidal protector is telling you about the exiles it protects and how much suffering they carry and how much they drive her crazy. The second one is usually talking about some part it hates that did something vile and is afraid it's going to do it again. So it's polarized with that part. Does it sound right? So my response is, makes sense you would want to kill her. If we could heal those exiles, if we could heal the pain, we could go to them, heal that pain, would you still have to kill her? No, but I don't think you can do that. It's like, duh, if I thought you could do that, I wouldn't be trying to kill her. Would you give me a chance to show you that we can? I guarantee we can, if you just give me the chance. Worked with highly, highly suicidal patients for 20 years, basically. Nobody killed themselves. Nobody even attempted. The biggest antidote to suicide is hope. When you fight the suicidal part, it will kick your ass. If you honor it and give it some hope, it doesn't want to die. It knows it's going down with the ship. Does this make sense? So that's the negotiation with protectors, virtually any protector. If you give us permission, we can go in there, relieve whatever you're reacting to, so you're freed up to do something entirely different. What would you like to do instead? If you could do anything else inside, you'd be amazed that most of the time, the answer is the exact opposite that the part's been doing. The critic wants to be your cheerleader. The one who makes you hide wants to get you out there, so on and so on. So my pitch is, give us permission, and we can free you up to do that. We'll liberate you from this role that you hate. Most of them hate their roles. They just don't think it's safe to leave them. So, to do it quickly, it's hard in the beginning because you don't have this confidence that I have. You got to borrow some. So anyway, that's the pitch. The protector, it gives us permission or not. If it doesn't give us permission, we don't go. If it doesn't give us permission, we just stay with it. Keep working with it. Keep loving it up. Keep honoring it. Keep pitching to it. At some point, it gets worn down and it gives us permission.
Wood stocks are too low, sire.
Internal family systems model now is becoming much more popular, much more well known, and its rapid increase is.
So anyway, that's the pitch. The protector, it gives us permission or not. If it doesn't give us permission, we don't go. If it doesn't give us permission, we just stay with it. Keep working with it. Keep loving it up. Keep honoring it. Keep pitching to it. At some point, it gets worn down and it gives us permission. So we go to the exile. Sometimes exiles are furious with self initially. They turn their back. It's a little kid. Where were you when I needed you? You locked me up and abandoned me 20 years ago. Why should I talk to you? Why should I have anything to do with you? Sometimes there has to be this kind of repair where self apologizes. I'm really sorry I wasn't there for you. I didn't actually have the body to protect you, but I wish I could have. And I'm sorry I let these other parts talk me into locking you up all this time. And now I'm here to help you and get you out of here. Some kind of repair like that. So we don't do anything until there's this trusting relationship between the self and the exile. At which point I used to think, okay, that's great, we're done. But it turns out that that isn't enough because these burdens are still there. And to unburden, parts need two other steps at least. First, they need you, not me, the therapist, necessarily. They need yourself to get what happened when they got hurt or shamed or terrified and how bad it was. They need you to become a compassionate witness to your own history. And to do that until they feel fully witnessed. Like now you finally get it. You finally get it. At which point they need you to go into that scene and be with them in the way they needed back then, which might involve a whole big deal of yelling at the abuser for them or talking to the mother and whatever they needed back there, doing that until they're ready to leave that time and place with you and come to a safe place. It could be in the present, it could be a fantasy place. At which point, when they feel like they can stay there, they don't have to ever go back, most these exiles are willing to unload the emotions and beliefs they got from those experiences. They're willing to unburden. And we have a little ritual for that, how they want to send it out of the system. It's the elements, light, water, fire, wind, earth, anything else, whatever they want to send it to. They send it out, immediately feel much lighter, much more playful. And sometimes much more exposed, much emptier. So we learned that there's also a step of having them invite into their body qualities they might need in the future, which kind of fills up whatever holes the burdens had been created when they left. And they feel more solid, they feel more consolidated. And now what do they want to do? And often they just want to play. And now we bring in all the protectors to see that they are freed up. They don't have to protect this one anymore. And some of them have this big, oh my God, what am I going to do now? Are you going to downsize me reaction? So we have to reassure them, no, there's another role waiting for you when you're ready. And they carry burdens too, and they may have to unburden themselves. They may need a whole session of their own. Many of them are stuck back in that same scene. They need their own retrieval before they be totally freed up to do this other role. So we do that, maybe the next session. And then it's off to the next, what we call clove of the garlic. So what psychotherapy, what vegetable has psychotherapy been compared to the most? Onion, where you peel away the layers and there's this core and you heal that and the client's done. IFS is a different vegetable. It's a bulb of garlic. We have all these different sort of isolated cloves that have sets of managers and firefighters and exiles based on one scene or two scenes. And you go in, you clear all that out, everybody's happy, but you didn't touch any of these other cloves. And so you've got to go to those too. And like that. Until you've cleaned out a lot, and clients are improving in many ways as they go. We did an outcome study recently of PTSD through the trauma center, Bessel van der Kolk's trauma center. 13 moderate to severe PTSD clients got 16 sessions of IFS. At the end, only one person still qualified for PTSD. And they still had a lot of work to do. So people are incrementally improving in their functioning, and they still got a bunch of exiles stuck in other places. So it's kind of, we just do it until people feel like, okay, you got most of it, I think. For now, anyway, I might come back. So that's the process. It is wonderful sacred work. I feel like I meditated for an hour. I don't feel drained after those sessions. I'm in self. If I notice my parts getting triggered, just relax. If you had a microphone on my head, just step back, let me handle this. You know, it always goes better if you let me stay. Just let me stay. I'm checking my body. This is how I notice how much self is present. My heart open. Do I have a big agenda here? If so, step back, step back. There's a kind of vibrating energy other systems call ki or prana. We call this self-energy that vibrates, runs through my body when I'm really there. I'm checking, is that running? Is that happening? That's mainly what I'm doing, and then offering a little guidance here and there to clients. And the other nice thing about IFS is clients do it on their own. I have a bunch of clients who the first 15, 20 minutes, they're just reciting everything they did during the week. And then we go in and we do some more. Because it becomes a life practice. It's not a psychotherapy, really. It's a way of being in the world where you're noticing who's here all the time. And you're inviting them to trust you more and more all the time. So there are three main goals with IFS, with individuals. The first one, talked about a lot, which is the liberation of these parts from their roles they're stuck in, whether they're protectors or exiles, so they can be who they're designed to be. Second one, what I call the restoration of trust of the parts in the self's leadership. And the third is the reharmonizing of this inner system so that parts get to know and cooperate with each other and love each other and becomes one big happy inner family. And when people get there, they feel much more unitary. Not because the parts have disappeared, which is the pernicious idea that was perpetrated by the DID community. What they call integration was the disappearance of parts. They are there, but because they're in harmony, they don't stand out. Anybody seen on YouTube maybe this murmurization of starlings? You know what I'm talking about? If you haven't seen it, Google it. It's amazing. Because it looks like one organism moving flock of birds, you know. And you could still pull a bird out of that flock, it would have autonomy. But when it's in that energy, that sort of energetic unity, it's in harmony. It seems like one organism. That's what we're shooting for. Questions now? Or reactions? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between self as an adult and self as a child?
No difference. So self doesn't develop.
That I thought, so it's the same.
Now, what develops is the hardware. So self can only manifest depending on how much of a brain you have or how much of a body you have. So a child can't manifest as much self in the outside world. But kids can access enough self to heal themselves. Is this making any sense?
Yeah, I just have quite a few clients right now that have that an exile doesn't, is rejecting self. So I'm just trying to figure out my understanding of this.
Yeah.
And I know that there needs to be repair work.
And that's what I'll often have clients say. I didn't have the body back then to protect you. I didn't have the hardware.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and parts get it. The exiles will get that. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the optimum balance between you talking to parts and parts talking to parts?
Good question, yeah. Oh, what's the optimum balance between me talking to parts and parts talking to parts? Well, you missed a possibility in there, which is self talking to parts.
But that's a part talking to parts. But
No.
I understand, okay, it's not a part.
It's not a part.
Okay.
Right. So ideally, self is talking to parts. Now, there are many times, especially with certain clients, where either that's not possible or it's efficient for me to talk to the part directly. And that's a process we call direct access, as opposed to what we call insight, which is when self is talking to parts. So the reason we privilege self to part interaction, this is what I call attachment theory taken inside. We want self to become that good attachment figure rather than therapist. So if I talk to the exiles all the time, they're going to attach to me, which is a lot of what traditional psychotherapy is. And you work the transference, and the therapist becomes that attachment figure. And in attachment-based therapies, that's the goal, for you to become a kind of internalized, good parent. Am I right? Now, that's hard work. So this is different. This is privileging that relationship, that inner relationship between self and the parts. Because when my clients are done, they say some version of, you're a pretty good therapist, but I healed myself. And that's what you're shooting for. That's what you want. So, but direct access is really important. And there are 4 reasons we typically shift from insight to direct access. One of them is, like I said earlier, when there's just no access to self, you don't have a choice. You know you're talking to a part. And there's very little trust in self, so you're not getting much there. So I'll just make it explicit. Okay, so now I'm talking to this part that doesn't trust me. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. So you're the part of Tom who doesn't trust anybody? Yeah, that's right. Okay, tell me about why you don't trust me. And I'll have this personal relationship with it, communication with it. And at some point I'll say, okay, it's great to get to know you. Let me talk to Tom again. Are you there? Yeah. Did you hear all that? Yeah. How do you feel toward this part now? So it's also a way to separate. You get a little more separation from a part that's very blended. We didn't really talk about blending, but it's a big part of the model too. There are times where the system is so afraid of a part, it would take session after session to get the scared parts to go into a kind of waiting room, that it just is efficient for me to talk to, like a suicide part. Let me talk to this part that wants to kill you. Oh, okay, so you're the one who wants to kill Risa, is that right, Risa? Okay, why do you want to kill her? And I'll have this, so, and then in the conversation, they're learning it isn't what they thought, and then everybody relaxes about it more, and now they're not so afraid of it, now we can work with it. And I'll hand the baton back to the client self. And then whenever there's a part that doesn't trust me or doesn't trust anybody, I want to talk to it directly. I want to have a personal relationship with it. So let me talk to the one that doesn't trust. I'll do direct access with it. So those are some of the common reasons. We'll flip to direct access, but generally trying to flip back to self, who, again, we're trying to have be the primary caretaker. Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm dealing with some client parts that think the world runs magically. What do you do with that?
You mean yourself or your client? A client has a part that thinks the world runs magically.
For example, he would ask the question, did your words affect the water that you drink, and therefore shouldn't you drink the water?
He has a part that would ask, did my words affect this water, so he shouldn't drink the water, something like that. There's a bit of paranoia to it.
Yes.
So I actually, the other plenary at our conference this year is going to be on schizophrenia, because I've had a lot of luck with schizophrenics. This is the first time I've got video of it. So I've got a video of a guy in a second, this is a consult, second consult with him, where we go to the schizophrenic part, love it up, give it a lot of honoring, and it talks about what it protects, and it shifts out of that kind of thinking. Don't argue with it, don't get into the details of whether its paranoid fantasies are real or not. Just try and love it up and give it a lot of kudos for protecting so well, and ask more about what it was needed at the time and what it's protecting. Yeah. So too often, the big mistake clients do is they get into the debating the story that the part is giving for its protective reason, which are debates you'll never win. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question about explaining to parts that don't trust self why it was that self allowed the protectors to lock them up. And is it because self recognized the external resources were not there? And
That's one of those questions I don't really have the answer to. Why so? Because it's very similar in a way. Why does self allow certain protectors to totally take over is something I don't totally know. It's similar to the question people ask, if God is so powerful, why did God let this happen? It's basically the same question, right? I don't know. Ask God, I have no idea. And the selves I've talked to don't really know either. It just kind of happens. It's one of those rules. I mean, there is one level of a very spiritual answer, which is if this stuff didn't happen this way, we wouldn't learn anything here. And this is a very difficult school. And these guides are all cheering the fact that they chose to do this here. So if self could be all powerful, then there wouldn't be much to learn, basically. Yeah?
We tend to have more parts as trauma increases.
Do we take on more parts? Is that what you said?
Create more, like...
Yeah, so this is another myth that came out of the trauma world, starting with Pierre Genet, who I love in many ways. He made many, many discoveries that are very useful, but he saw parts, and he identified them, but he assumed they were the product of trauma. So he assumed that it was the mono mind, the unitary mind, that was blown apart by the trauma, so he pathologized them. So parts are not created. They are forced into extreme roles. So if you ask the question, are there more parts that get it forced into more extreme roles, the answer is yes, the more trauma you accrue. I didn't mention legacy burdens, and I should. So far I've talked about burdens you got from direct experience in your life, but there's another class of burden that's very important we call legacy burdens that came into your system through your family or from your ethnic group or from our culture, all the isms, sexism and patriarchy and homophobia and all of those. We all take on a little bit, pieces of, and parts carry those. Racism. So these are burdens, actually, once you get to them, in some ways are easier to unburden because you don't have to do the witnessing. It didn't happen to you. You don't have to do the retrieval. It's stuck, it might be decades or generations earlier that just trickled down in your family. So when you get to them, you can often, do you like carrying this stuff? No, I don't. Didn't know I had a choice. Would you like to unload it? Yeah, that'd be great. Boom, you can unload it. Except for the many times when they say, if I unload this, I'm being disloyal to my people, or I lose my relationship with my father, this is the only thing, or he's going to suffer because I've been carrying this for him, or there are those kind of common objections. So we just negotiate those. But that's a whole other class of burdens. Yeah?
Have you ever come across somebody that focuses on body symptoms but cannot pull out parts?
Focus on body symptoms, but what?
Cannot pull out parts.
Can't pull out parts from that?
Yeah.
Initially, some people have a, what do you think, I'm Sybil kind of reaction to the idea that they have parts. And so there is a part that's blocking any access. And so then I'll say, is there a part that's really afraid to focus inside and to do this work? And that's usually what it's about, and then I'll work with that part. Okay, how are we doing break-wise?
How long is the video, Dick?
It'd take about 50 minutes.
Okay, so...
So we should take a break now.
Take a break now, or
Yeah.
maybe take a couple more questions because they're still setting up the bookstore and then take a break?
Okay, sure.
Check the bookstore.
A couple more questions, yeah. Ken?
Maybe not a question, but an answer to the person who was asking, why did the self-protector become extreme?
Yeah.
And you answered, I don't know.
Well, I was more answering, why does the self allow protectors to take over?
Okay. So I have struggled with this question, and I found a quote that helped me have some peace with not having the answer. And it's from Keats, a poet, in 1813 or 1830. He wrote about a negative capability. Not negative in a bad way, but a capability to be with uncertainty, mystery, and doubts, without the irritable need to grasp after fact or reason.
There you have it. Yeah.
So, how much agency does self have by itself? That's a sort of
Yeah.
underline to this question. Does it need to ally with effective parts?
No. So, I mean, there are various conceptions of self in the Eastern spiritual traditions, for example, which are very passive. And Jung adopted that idea of self, basically, as a passive witness, a place to get to, but not an active leader. And so I assumed that was the case when I first encountered it. But just as I experimented over and over, once fully released, self has tremendous agency. And there are many protectors that don't believe that initially. And so they think, if I don't keep doing this and protecting you this way, self is a wimp, you know? But it turns out, here, I didn't get into this. So when I was observing self in all these different people, at some point I decided to catalog the qualities that would emerge spontaneously. So we have what we call the 8 C's of self-leadership, and I mentioned, I think, 4 so far. But most common in the beginning ones are curiosity. Certain parts step back, how do you feel now? Just curious, but said from a place of calm and confidence. And confidence. And like I said, sometimes very spontaneously, compassion is there. I feel sorry for the part, care about it, I want to help it. So this is another myth that's in the spiritual traditions, that you have to build up the muscle of compassion by practicing metta or whatever the practice is all the time. You don't. It's right there. It's just beneath the surface of these parts that keep your heart closed. When they open your heart, it's all right there. So compassion, and then courage. So inherent in self is courage. Courage to go into these abysses inside, courage to deal with people on the outside. Clarity. So you have a client focus on a part that they're afraid of, it looks like a monster. It's very threatening. You ask the fear to step back. They look at it again, it looks like a teenage kid. Their image has shifted. Now it's a much more clear image of what it really is, the part. And the same is true when you're working with couples. I'll show some video of that maybe. And they're in their protectors when they're interacting with each other, and you get both to go in and get their protectors to step back. They suddenly look much more attractive to each other. And I've had that experience now maybe a monthly basis. In the beginning, it was a lot more frequently with my wife, where there's a part that when she triggers it, she looks really ugly. I can't stand how she looks. Why did I marry this person? And then as soon as it steps back, oh, that's why. She's beautiful. Anybody identify with that? So clarity, that should be 7, right? 6? Oh, creativity. Creativity. And then connectedness, yeah. So those are the 8 C's of self-leadership. And especially courage, confidence, and clarity imply action and the ability to act in the outside world and the inside world much more effectively. Like I've been training social activists in France the last couple of years, and most of them are they came to social activism because of something that happened to them when they were a kid. And so they have parts that get involved in the social activism and alienate people. They're righteous, you know. And when we get them to do it from self, it's a totally different response from other people. And they're much more effective. Self is much more effective than protectors at protecting you. So, yeah.
Got a client, they've identified that the exiles are in a vault. You can describe it, written poetry about it. There's about 20 locks on it. Do we go in with one lock at a time?
No. Yeah, initially,
Can you repeat the question?
yeah, this young lady has a client who's got her exiles in a vault with 20 locks on it. And the question is, do we have to go through each lock one at a time? Usually the big, scary fortress thing is some part just showing how impenetrable it is. And if you work with that part, then it's like I was saying about my wife being ugly. Suddenly, the exiles are there once it gives you permission. Yeah. Yeah.
So I have,
Glad she didn't come this week.
so I have clients who have difficulty finding the part inside their body. Their body is it's so hard to be with.
Yeah, or they're out of their body. They don't feel their body. They're scared to feel their body. So yeah, in such clients, you first want to work with the parts that keep them out of their body and are afraid to let them feel anything. And they're usually pretty severe trauma survivors. Yeah. I was just at the trauma conference that the Bessel's group organizes last weekend, actually. And they're recommending all these body-centered, bottom-up approaches, like yoga, like a bunch of other things, because it's too threatening, and what they say, the cerebral cortex isn't online, and blah, blah, blah. And my thing was, and I said it, a lot of people that are going to really be very, very upset if you start trying to do yoga with them, until you've worked with their protectors who don't want them to feel anything and gotten permission to start doing these body practices. So, yeah. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about legacy burdens? Because one thing that is coming up with a lot of young people that I see is they're deeply, deeply affected right now by Me Too, by racism, by many things that actually have not necessarily affected them personally.
Right.
But they have certainly burdened themselves, particularly, I'm quite connected to university students, so
Yeah.
particularly on campuses.
Yeah.
And it's almost like within the space of 6 months or a year, some of the young people that I work with have become traumatized by what they see or are exposed to through their colleagues at university or on social media.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I haven't worked with college kids for quite a while, so it's hard for me to speak to this particular phenomena very articulately. But in general, like for example, when I work with therapists who are burned out, this might be an analogy. Generally, you can find a part that thinks that for them to be effective, they have to take in the energy of their client. They have to take in some of that emotion and carry it with them. And often, if you go back, when they were kids, they were so desperate for their parents to get along that they would take in some of that energy to try and be effective. And it may be analogous, I don't really know. Yeah, I can't be articulate about that, I'm sorry. Yeah.
It's not the same because it's what's mine, what's not mine, right? So it's almost like those, you said you don't like that, but it's almost introjected,
Yeah.
right? Beliefs, also perpetrators' voice is introjected. So should that be analyzed in the same way as you would analyze something that's not yours?
You know, the analogy to an introject is a burden. And as long as you think of it as something that gets stuck in a part rather than the part itself, I'm fine with the word.
What part, the exiles or? Like
Different parts take on different burdens, but in her case, it's probably exiles that feel for the victims, and then protectors who take on this righteous, you know, we've got to do something about this. Which, you know, now that I think back, I'm a child of the 60s, and I was no less obnoxious back then. And I had those parts. If I had a gun and Nixon was in front of me, boom, you know? So I think it's just the age, partly. Yeah.
Well, I had a question about kind of staying on there with the legacy burden, and potentially, I'm wondering how they intersect with if they do have like something similar. Could that be where
If they do have a similar,
like similar traumas, it's almost like a legacy burden that they have
yeah, and then in their life something similar to the,
similar to whatever that they
yeah, so whatever's similar to the burdens you already carry gets amplified in a big way. So a lot of vets we work with, for example, who have PTSD, you go and they've got parts stuck in battle. And our pitch to the Marines, for example, is, you know, their motto is no man left behind. You left those parts behind. Let's go get them. They love that. And once you get there, most of them have parts that are stuck in similar places in the past, or they carry legacy burdens that got triggered by that. So, yeah.
How much when we talk about asking like the parts to step aside or looking at them and governing themselves, how much of this needs to be done client in your office, or how much do you encourage client to do this outside of their office?
I encourage clients to do it outside my office all the time, and also to follow up. So if we do an unburdening and there's this little child who's now playful on the beach, my homework assignment is for a month or so, every day, just make sure she's still okay. Just go as a meditation, just check with her and see if she needs anything, just remind her you're there. And if they do it for a month, then it sticks, it absolutely sticks. Last one.
I have a question about shame, because I know burden is often about shame. I am wondering if you have a thought about why we have shame as an emotion to begin with.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Why do we have shame as an emotion? Shame for me is a three-part phenomenon. So there's a part that when your parent said you sucked, took that to heart and believed it, and now believes that you're worthless. And then there's a part that imitates your parent and tells you you suck. And then there's a part that reacts to the shame in a firefighter way to get you away from it. But the firefighter activity brings on the critic inside and the critic outside more, which goes right to the heart of that exile who feels worthless and makes the exile have more worthlessness, which makes the firefighter's job that much harder, and you get this vicious cycle. So why do we have shame? Well, I'm not sure exactly how to answer that, except that we are born with the knowledge that to survive we have to be valued by our caretakers and by the tribe. And if we're not, we're going to die. So kids all over the world do die because they're not valued. So we know this. This is in our, we come with that knowledge. And so we have an inbuilt desire to be accepted. And any chronic messages to the contrary are terrifying and motivate the parts that want so desperately to be accepted. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
And that's a big player in couples. Should I do a little riff on that before we break? So, most of us come out of our families with that burden of worthlessness, And with the burden of worthlessness comes this terror that you're not going to survive, and the drive for redemption from the person who said you were worthless. So a drive to make that person change their mind, or someone who looks, sounds, or acts like that person. And then when we go to find our partner, we have that template of the caretaker who made us feel worthless, who, if we can change their mind, we're going to survive. Everybody with this so far? It's a little, oh yeah. It's a little depressing. So you look around and you get this big hit of infatuation when you see the person who resembles your father, who in a certain way, who now says you're valuable and wants to protect you. And you get this rush because now you're going to live. Now you might even be happy. Now you're not worthless anymore. Now you're not going to die. Okay? Now, unfortunately, that person is like your father. And so they wind up hurting you the same way. And so when that happens, your protectors go into one of 4 operations. First is to try to get them to change. So you start to either blame or cajole or somehow focus all your change attempts on your partner, change back into being the redeemer. When that doesn't work, you go into changing yourself. So you lose weight, you stop being bitchy, you try to other ways to please. That doesn't work. This is not Mr. Right. Mr. Right is still out there somewhere. Mrs. Right. You give up on that person. Your parts start to scan. You get burned enough from that, you give up on human beings and you go to drugs or work or something that can take care of you without the need for a human being, which many of our trauma survivors are in that place. But many couples come in and one partner is in one of those protector modes and the other is in another one of those. That's how they start out. Does that make sense? 15 minutes.
Just give me a second. So while you're all reflecting on your infatuations, I know I am, bookstores outside Caversham, there's 3 books that are new for those of you that were here in September. One is the Internal Family Systems Skill Training Manual, good for therapists, also good for clients. I've got clients that have been reading this and there's exercises, worksheets and techniques, meditations. There's a daily parts meditation practice by Michelle Glass, which has a lot of stuff you can use inside as well. And I love this. This is so
Thank you, good,
Oh.
thank you.
Many Minds, One Self. Dick's latest book, overview of, as I remember, overview of evidence of multiplicity from various perspectives, including shamanism, how psychology has played with multiplicity in and out over the last decade, how Freud was close and then backed off, how different world religions have spoken about self and how it all comes together in this model. At least that's my reading of it.
Very good.
I highly recommend this one.
Very good, thank you.
If you can, 15 minutes, because we've got a lot to get through. And there's tea and coffee outside. This model, at least that's my reading of it.
Very good.
Freud, overview of, as I remember, oneself. I love this. This is so
Thank you, good,
Oh.
thank you.
Daily Parts Meditation Practice by Michelle Glass, which has a lot for clients. I've got clients that have been reading Family Systems Spokesstations. 2 for those of you that were here in September. One is the Internal Family Systems Skill Training Manual, good for therapists, also good for clients. I've got clients that have Internal Family Systems Skill Training Manual. Good for therapists, also good for clients. I've got clients that have been reading this and there's exercises, worksheets and techniques, meditations. There's a daily parts meditation practice by Michelle Glass, which has a lot of stuff you can use inside as well. And I love this. This is so
Thank you, good,
Oh.
thank you.
Many Minds, One Self. Dick's latest book, overview of, as I remember, overview of evidence of multiplicity from various perspectives, including shamanism, how psychology has played with multiplicity in and out over the last decade, how Freud was close and then backed off, how different world religions have spoken about self and how it all comes together in this model. At least that's my reading of it.
Very good.
I highly recommend this one.
Very good, thank you.
If you can, 15 minutes, because we've got a lot to get through. And there's tea and coffee outside.
Yes, boss. Recruits needed, sire. Need some muscle? How do we get there? Ballista, shield ready. Some more come.
So she does okay with dissociating with client when they start to dissociate and doesn't resort to grounding. But when a panic key part comes in, it's very hard for you to stay and you get triggered and you start to do the grounding. Is that accurate? Yeah, so,
They get so like agitated and panicked and
right.
get me out of here.
Right. So it's a really important comment because on several levels. First, I talked about the 8 C's, but we also have what I call the 5 P's in IFS, which are qualities of the therapist in addition to the 8 C's. Guesses about the 5 P's? Patience. What? Playfulness. People don't usually guess that one. That is one. Presence. Perseverance. Okay, you guys know it. You're cheating. And the one you didn't mention is perspective, which is really the IFS perspective. So what you're getting, I hope by now, is this is a very different paradigm for understanding trauma and all these other things. And one of the big differences is dissociation, flashbacks, panic attacks. What else with trauma? Resistance, flooding, numbing, dissociation are not pathological psychological processes. They're the activity of protective parts. It's a huge shift in understanding of these things. If you think of them as pathological psychological processes, you've got to do something to control them. If you think of them as the activity of protective parts, you go to the part, you get to know it, you honor it for what it's trying to do, and you negotiate it, separate it. Huge difference. So the minute you do grounding skills with somebody who's got a panic attack, you're telling this terrified little girl, get out of here. You don't belong here. So if somebody's having a panic attack, I'll say, it's great you're here, just like I did here. It's really good. You're really welcome here. I get you're stuck in a really scary place. We're going to get you out of there. It'll be a little easier to get you out of there if you'd separate a little bit so she can be with you and not be so blended with you. Would you be willing to pull your energy out of her a little bit? And boom, she's grounded. That's a totally different message to the part. You following this? Yeah. So this, you got me on my soapbox. This is my crusade to the trauma field. Yeah.
So sometimes working with very young parts that have gone through abuse and they're coming out of profound dissociation, and we clean them up and dress them and untie them. And what happens is then the image patients or clients will say will degrade, and they'll go home and they'll look again and the rope's back on and the bloody underwear's back on.
Really good question. So there are times when burdens come back. And I used to get very discouraged and think, oh, this doesn't really work. And then I got curious and asked around, why are they coming back? Turns out there are 4 common reasons. So we find out which of those it is, we fix that, now they don't come back. So you want to know what they are? So the most common reason they come back probably is that you didn't get the whole story in the witnessing. There's more the part needs to show you. So she went back in, so you'd be forced to see the rest. Second most common is client didn't follow up during the week. So the part felt good in the session, was in a nice place when we left, but then felt abandoned by the self and went back to what was familiar. Third, the unburdening of this part scared other protectors who relied on this burden to control the client. So just a quick example. Let's say it was the burden of worthlessness, and we shipped it out, and now this little girl feels great, like here. But there was some controlling protector that would poke the worthlessness to keep her from doing something it thought was dangerous, and now it can't control her. And so it sent it back. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And the fourth, you know, Derek? There's something during the week after the session, scary, that happens, and the parts assume it's because you did this unburdening and are superstitious about it, and they kind of throw her back. So it's generally one of those four. Then you find out which it is, you fix that one, and then the burden sticks, unburdening sticks. Yeah. Yeah.
Is this what you would say why backlash happens?
Backlash happens, that third one is part of the backlash. But backlash in general happens when you don't respect the protector's pace and you go too fast to exiles. And if you're going to work with serious trauma, you've got to have a fairly high threshold for some degree of backlash. Because I've done it where I did everything right. I up front asked all the protectors I could find if it was okay. I got permission from all of them, and still there was backlash. And I went to the party. I said, I thought you gave me permission. Yeah, but I couldn't help myself. You know, was the kind of reaction. So, so then you go to the part, the backlash. You get to know it. You say, okay, I get it. It's terrifying, and so on. Then you work with it. It becomes the target part, and you help it heal. The important thing to remember is all this stuff is the activity of parts. So too many, I mean, this is my big crusade with EMDR, with all kinds of systems, because you can bypass protectors by doing this and go too quickly to exile, and then clients have backlash reactions, and the therapist thinks, oh, she's sicker than I thought. This is more scary than I thought. Let's bring in the medication, let's bring in the hospitals, and you get this vicious downward spiral that way. And I picked up the pieces from many such clients. So this is my appeal to the trauma field. Just respect the pace of the protectors. Many people are combining IFS and EMDR now. Before they do any of this, ask if there's any parts that don't want to go there, and just get permission, and then do this. And it works fine.
So I noticed that you say a lot, just stay with it, just stay with her. So what's that about? Because
mainly I'm speaking to the protectors. I'm saying this is okay to stay with. I'm telling self to stay with the exile, and just stay with the feelings, and just let them come, and just stay with those feelings. It's okay. Just constantly saying, this is okay, this is good. Yeah. But mainly I'm speaking to the protectors who, they're in a waiting room, but they're just dying to jump out and take over. So, yeah.
I was a little confused about the age and the time, because earlier what I heard was that you were helping her to know that she's 40, but then it seemed like you were also giving the 18-year-old permission to be 18 or to feel 18. I'm wondering if you can talk about the time orienting of the parts.
Well, from my point of view, it's real. It's an 18-year-old little girl, not little girl, 18-year-old girl in there who shouldn't have to be responsible, shouldn't have to be running things, but has been running things, has been one of these parentified children. And so I'm not sure your question, so I'm just saying.
Okay, so the self, you see the self as being the age of the biological person, but the parts
Are whatever age they are, yeah.
whatever age they are. And
Yeah.
they don't change. Like, will that
Sometimes they change, but sometimes they get younger when they unburden. Sometimes they get older, but they'll go to the age for which they're designed, is my take, when they unburden. And they don't grow, they don't usually get older than that. Yeah. How do we medicate people without giving the message that they need this extra protection? Is that basically the question?
Yeah, or that the protector's not welcome.
Because we're trying to medicate the protector out of business, yeah. And so much of medicine is designed to kill the messenger rather than to listen to the message. So, so what Frank will say, because there are medications, especially when you're really blended with a lot of scary parts, that just create a little separation, that just help with the unblending so the client can actually work with the part rather than be the part. And so those are actually helpful medications, temporary, as long as it's seen as temporary. But the same medication with a different client will kind of shut everything down, so it's very hard to interact with anybody inside. So Frank will try a medication and then just say, ask your parts if this is getting in the way or if this is helping in communication in there. And based on the feedback from the parts, he'll adjust the medication dosage or he'll try a different medication. So it becomes a kind of collaboration with the parts of the client. And they can pretty accurately tell you if it's getting in the way or not. And also, another thing he'll do is, there are parts, for example, in trauma survivors that don't want you to sleep. You give them sleep medication, and they're going to override that, or they're going to try their best, or they're going to feel like you don't get it. And they're going to be angry at the psychiatrist, they'll be angry at the client for overriding them. So before he'll go to give sleep medication, he'll just say, is there anybody in there who really doesn't want this to work? And he'll do the work up front and get permission, and then the medication works.
Hello. So I was just going to say that part of the deal with trauma is the rage, and just to watch that powerful demonstration of rage moving through her. And it sounds as if her husband is getting a fair bit of that rage,
Right.
and he takes it on, and it's
Right.
very wounding to him. But if he can just see that it's a response to really a terrible thing, that he doesn't need to get sucked into it.
That's right. That's really true. And also she's going to have less rage. Great. She's going to have less rage once this little girl is healed. Better? Oh, much better? Oh, okay. All right. And we can unload the rage. But in the meantime, it does help him with perspective on it, and it's not about him, and so on. So this is a big couples intervention, to have one partner do the work while the other partner witnesses it. Now, you need to be sure that the witnessing partner is going to be able to stay in self, because you don't want her to come out and feel any kind of judgment or any kind of fear or anything, or, yeah.
There was the clouds, the words in the clouds,
Yeah,
the black smoke, I mean.
yeah,
And at one point she says, it's your fault, or it's my fault. I didn't
it's my fault.
And I could tell that you were a little bit like disturbed, but I would be disturbed by that.
Oh, there was a point where parts came in to say that it was her fault. Right? The burden, there was the burden of it's my fault and I'm alone and what else? Ugly, contempt. Somebody took good notes, yeah. So those were all burdens coming out of her in the smoke. And then there were other times where parts came in and tried to blame her, and I got them back into the waiting room right away. I didn't spend any time with them. Is that what you're asking about? Yeah. So as you can see, I'm kind of a hard ass with these protectors. When we're focused on an exile, I get very protective of the exile. And I don't want any of these guys coming in and shitting on it. And I also know that once we heal the exile and we bring them all in, they're going to change. They're going to see her very differently, and they're going to relax, and they're not going to be doing those bad things. So it behooves me to just get them out as best I can until we're done, and then everybody relaxes. So that's my style, is to not spend a huge amount of time schmoozing with protectors if I can avoid it, because you're mainly getting them in their extreme state, and they'll run you around and around with their stuff. But if you can just heal what they're protecting, then they're very different afterwards. Yeah.
I'm just amazed that they listen, like you say, back in the waiting room.
Yeah.
That's pretty direct.
Very direct. And you got to be comfortable with that. And they listen, and sometimes they don't. So this is one of those videos where they listen. But I've got them where they don't. And so there are times where I'll have to stop working with that little girl and just focus on the one who won't leave and do a whole piece of work with it. It might take us in a whole different tangent and then ultimately come back. Just like you saw at the end, I came back to the little girl who thought she killed her mother. That one's probably going to need another session because we didn't have time to really get into that. But you kind of bookmark it and you say, I'm going to be sure to come back here, but right now we got to do this. But the point being, it's sort of Taoist in the sense that you're going with the flow. If you get stuck, you don't fight the one who's stuck. It becomes the new target part. And you work with it, and then you go to the next one. Yeah.
I think the other thing you have not mentioned is your presence.
Yeah, so what do you want to say about my presence?
I want to say that your presence is grounded enough or present enough or still enough that when they come in, you're just...
Here's the next one. Right. Yeah, so you could see all those C words in my presence, and lack of judgment, total acceptance of whatever's coming, and calm, and it's sort of like one of the things I love about the GPS is you can get totally way off course, and it says, now you're here, now you go here. It doesn't say, what the hell were you doing? How did you get over it? Yeah.
To what extent is the flow that you want to work with and the route interfered with by the clock?
Yeah, so...
How much do you have to look at the clock and say, I can't go there now, I have to do something?
Another good question. So you might have noticed I looked at the clock a couple times. That's what I was looking at. Yeah, I was looking at the clock, and in my office I look at my watch, do I have time to do the next piece? You know, we've got to the exile, we have this trusting relationship that's happened. Do I really have time to do the witnessing? No.
A lot of places that you work very hard to get to, and it would seem like it might be a challenge to get back there.
That's right. And when that's the case, when I really think it's going to be really hard to get back, I'll run over. I'll just do what it takes till we do the unburdening. But if I don't feel like that, like there's a lot of clients I have where, you know, we got 10 minutes left. Do I really have time to do the witnessing? Probably not. We're going to freeze it right here. We're going to pick it up here next week. And they can, and we do. So there are these stages, and you just kind of can freeze it between any of these stages.
Do you actually use that term?
Freeze it here? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Why do I ask, can you find it in or around your body? That's just because some people find them around their body. Before we jump to the couples thing, and because this kind of came up at lunch, I was going to show a video from, how many of you have heard of the research that's being done with MDMA and PTSD? Okay. So they're going into phase 3 trials. It's very impressive. It's comparable results to the results we got with PTSD. And it seems that the medicine, the MDMA, has the effect of helping people access a huge amount of self very quickly. And it turns out that when people do access a huge amount of self quickly, most of them begin to work with their parts in the way that you just saw, that most people spontaneously, without any cueing from the therapist, begin to do this work. And when I first saw these videos, it was so confirming because it just showed that I stumbled onto something that everybody knows how to do. That's just natural, inherent in us to do this. So the guy that spearheads the whole thing is named Michael Mithofer, and he's an IFS therapist, well-trained, totally into IFS. And what he found was almost 80% of these people, up till now, spontaneously start to work with their parts without any cueing from him. And we don't seem to need it, so because we can access stuff in other ways. So use that as a segue to shift into couples. So when we work with couples, like I said earlier, most of the time they come in and it's parts wars. There's no self to be found. And it's just these protectors, looping and escalating each other. And so part of the hard work in the beginning is to achieve that U-turn in focus, such that each partner starts to listen inside themselves rather than keeping their eye on the other person as the person who needs to change. And then as they do that, we get to know their parts, and there are ways to kind of track the sequences between them in their fights, which I learned to do in family therapy. So when you do this, what do you do? And when you do that, what happens then? And just find the whole vicious circle of it. But you can add a loop to that tracking. So when she does this, what happens inside of you? Oh, it triggers this part and this part and this part, is that right? Okay, and which of those then takes over? This one, okay. And when that part of you takes over, what do you do or say? And then to the other partner, when he says that, what happens inside of you? And so we're kind of bringing to the surface the parts on both sides that are so triggered by these interactions. And then at some point asking if each of them will commit to work with their side of it, with their parts. And also perhaps negotiating whether or not they'd be willing to do that in the presence of the other or not, how safe that feels. And I'll make that call, because a lot of times one partner is afraid to say they don't want the other to be there. So if I don't feel like it's safe, I'm going to say, you need to step out while we do this work. So that's one side of the work with couples, is again, just achieving the U-turn, getting the parts that get triggered by each side on the table, and have them contract to start doing this kind of work, and then do a session like you saw with Annie, either with the partner there